States must protect and promote cultural diversity. The alternative to regulation of and intervention in markets is the extinction of whole cultures and mediums of expression. Setting aside the negative's repeated ad hominem attacks, we have presented 3 justifications for state-sanctioned cultural diversity. First, market failure. We do not have to win that markets always fail, just that they ever fail, which is uncomfortable given that the negative has introduced 0 qualified evidence to answer the claims made by Valentio Vadi and the International Fund for Cultural Diversity in Danny's first speech. The argument is simply that markets cannot always account for the value attached to both the production and expression of cultural diversity. Our second argument about minority cultures and the right to cultural expression. Absent state intervention to preserve and protect the rights of minorities and subcultures to cultural expression, the global and national markets will simply accelerate the status quo's drive to overly commercialized monoculture. Our Apanduri and Graeber evidence describe the importance of a prior commitment of the state to multiculturalism in order to provide a framework to allow these subcultures to flourish. Third is the intrinsic and non-quantifiable value of diverse cultural expression. History, identity, aesthetics, lineage, language, traditions. These are things that do not have a dollar value, but are the very instruments and institutions by which we give meaning to our lives. The very things that give value to human existence are cultural expression. You can't always put a dollar value on it, but that doesn't mean it's not valuable. The example of Sao Paulo, Brazil, unanswered in the first negative speech, offers a concrete example of all 3 of these benefits to state-sanctioned cultural diversity. Here is an example of the state using its existing infrastructure to level the playing field to allow small local cultural producers to compete, and at a macro level organizing events such as festivals and expos whereby culture can be demonstrated. You should not allow the negative to answer these arguments in their next speech, as they clearly encapsulate the entire affirmative case, were clearly articulated in the first speech, and we sadly don't have another speech to answer any points they would bring up. Now to their arguments about scarce resources. This cuts both ways. We have demonstrated above and throughout our first speech the unique benefits of cultural diversity, but they have failed to demonstrate the unique benefits of the dollars we allegedly trade off with. Make them prove that the dollars we would spend elsewhere are more valuable. Their arguments about value and pricing only apply at the point of sale. They do not encapsulate the production and later consumption of culture, a distinction that is important for this debate, as Saikiko Fukuda explains. Why are cultural goods different? Cultural goods convey ideas, symbols, and lifestyles and are an intrinsic part of the identity of the community that produces them. Why do cultural goods need public support? The reasons have to do with the way cultural goods are consumed and produced. Both give advantages to large economies and industries with access to resources. Cultural goods are experience goods. Consumers will not know whether they like the good until after they have consumed it, so prices will not reflect the quality of the product. Small local producers will struggle to access the market, particularly producers operating from developing countries. For these reasons, cultural products and creative activities, if left to the market, could wither and diversity could decline. Some countries have successfully maintained healthy cultural industries while keeping trade open. Brazil offers financial incentives to help domestic industries. The thesis of this negative argument is a universalization of the rational utility maximizing behavior model, ironically an assumption that reflects the cultural traditions of Europe and America, not necessarily the entire world. It is awkward that there is not a single example in the 1NC of a non-Western form of cultural expression. The idea of rational exchange is intimately tied to our history, but not all cultures express themselves that way. The very idea of a non-exchange form of cultural valuation outside of the West disrupts this entire argument. The arguments about the internet. Have you ever heard of censorship? Without a prior commitment of states to diverse cultural expressions and multiculturalism, the state will inevitably intervene to privilege particular forms of culture. Also, the digital divide poses a powerful counterpoint to this argument. The negative has confused their ability to access iTunes, Google, and YouTube with the ability of the entire globe to. Disparities in material resources between people, i.e. Impoverished, disempowered subcultures need the state in order to develop the infrastructure to use the internet the way the negative has suggested. This is why countries that support broadband are an example of our argument. This is the exact role of the state in protecting cultural diversity, using its mass resources to create an institution or a framework that allows for these types of cultural expression. The internet is a compelling reason to vote affirmative in this debate. Finally, the negative's last argument, their criticism of culture and counter-advocacy. A quick question, does this counter-advocacy endorse the UNESCO Convention? If so, then it is identical to the affirmative and you should just vote for us. Or the negative's alternative does not endorse the UNESCO Convention, in which case it does not commodify the rights of people to cultural expression and solves none of our affirmative arguments. This ivory tower intellectual discussion of the ontology of culture does not get to the heart of the matter. Explicitly focusing on culture is critical, as Saikiko Fukada-Par explains. Cultural liberty will not just happen. Fostering it should be a core concern of governments. Some argue guaranteeing individual civil and political rights is enough. They argue cultural exclusion is a byproduct of economic and political exclusions. Once these are resolved, cultural exclusion will disappear. This has not happened. To expand cultural freedoms requires explicit policies to address denials of cultural liberty, multicultural policies. To do this, states need to recognize cultural differences. They also need to formulate policies to ensure that the interests of particular groups, whether minorities or historically marginalized majorities, are not ignored or overridden by the majority of dominant groups. Likewise, I agree with the part of the negative argument that says that culture in the abstract cannot be tied down, but people act as if culture is a thing, even if it's true that there's no abstract ontology of culture. The fact that individual actors throughout the globe believe that their culture gives them value is enough justification to vote affirmative. In the end of the day, the counter-advocacy is woefully insufficient and vague, and there is no justification for a negative ballot.